All right, we're going to go ahead and get started today. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This will be the second installation of a new monthly webinar series here at Pioneer B1 as part of our effort to bring more valuable content to you, the user. Today's webinar will be on materials requirements planning in SAP Business One. We'll be showing you tips and tricks to help you define your production and purchasing plans with the powerful MRP tools in SAP Business One. At the end of each section of the presentation, we will address any questions we receive in the text-based chat located to the right of your screen, and we will open the audio lines at the end of the presentation to answer any questions you may have. Today's presentation will be hosted by the CEO and founder of Pioneer B1, Oren Tabib, and our production expert and SAP project manager, Travis Thurston. And with that, I'll turn it over to them.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good morning. Happy Friday, everyone. We are planning to record this session. And we will send that recording when we finish today. Recording and today webinar will be around the MRP, and we are very, very excited to do that here today. And I'm very excited to present with Travis. Let's see what's our agenda today. First, we're going to look at make to stock and make to order. What are the two options within SAP to automate the procurement and production planning? With that being said, we're going to focus on the MRP, material resource planning, what settings you need to do in order to get it enabled, either in a company level or in the item master data settings. We'll look at forecast options. And then we will go through MRP Wizard and run a few runs of the MRP, see what recommendations we get and execute them. We know many customers of SAP Business One use the system, but neglect to use the MRP either because of lack of knowledge or sometimes it looks too complicated. So today we're going to try to simplify that. And through the sessions, if you have any questions or concerns or things you want to drill down into, please feel free to write in the chat or ask a question. At the end of the session, we're going to share additional documentation and learning materials, and we hopefully will have time for a Q&A. And with that being said, let's start with the make to stock and make to order. There are two options in SAP Business One to automatically create production orders and purchase orders based on sales orders or sales quotations. One of them is called the Procurement Wizard. It's more for companies who do make to order or dropship. And that allows you to automatically, based on open sales orders, create the procurement documents. But if it's a BOM item, bill of material item, it will do the production. The other thing is the make to stock. The make to stock is really the MRP, and this is what we're going to focus today. Some companies will use both. They are doing make to order, so they will create the production order based on the sales order, and then they will run MRP to generate the demand for the components of the BOMs and sub-assemblies. For both of those, there is the resource management available that allows you to manage costing and resource capacity. But today, really, we're going to focus on the MRP features of SAP Business One. Maybe in future sessions, we can talk about the procurement and the resource management. So, what's MRP?
Well, that's a great question, Oren. So MRP is materials requirement planning. It's a tool for managing inventory effectively, so the materials are available for production and products are available for sales when and where they are needed without having to keep overly high stock levels. But the question remains, what does that really mean for you guys? Well, it will allow you to better plan your production and procurement processes, which will allow for better managed inventory levels so that you can meet your customers' needs.
Basically, the MRP is kind of a blender. You put everything in it and you get some recommendations. What comes into the funnel, the demand, and you can choose sales orders, sales quotations, maybe forecasts that you have with clients, things of that nature. There is the supply, which is what's POs are coming, what open production orders we have, things of that nature. And what the item settings looks like. How much do you have on hand? What's the minimum quantity? What's the required quantity? Maybe you have maximum level, things of that nature. It puts everything into the calculation mechanism and give us 3 types of recommendations. What to buy, basically purchase orders recommendations, what to produce, production order recommendation, and you can also have the system recommend of transfers between warehouses if you have in one warehouse more inventory than the other warehouse. So that's on a nutshell, on a very high level, what the MRP wizard does.
So within SAP, there's a couple different areas which you can address some global settings. So if you go to the general settings in SAP, this allows you to be able to make adjustments for if you want to consume a forecast or if you want to have forecasts considered within the MRP. If you choose to consume a forecast, what that means is that for whatever sales orders or delivery documents are within the MRP that will be considered, and a forecasted amount of what you're planning on in that time period, those would be reducted from the forecast before the MRP makes a suggestion. Then if you are consuming that forecast, you have different consumption methods, whether that be a backward forward option or a forward backward, which generally just determines how the forecast will be consumed based on days backwards or forwards that you set.
Thank you, Travis. And this is applied just if you use the forecast. If you don't use the forecast, obviously this will be irrelevant.
That's correct.
The other thing, the other kind of company, in the company level, is the kind of the defaults for items created. So in the item group, you have a lot of definitions. You know, if it's going to be part of the MRP run, if it's a buy or make, things of that nature. All of those will be defaults as you create new items. Okay.
And so then the real meat and potatoes of the MRP comes into place on the item master settings itself under the planning data tab. This is where the MRP will consider if an item is to be included or not to be included within the MRP. That's based upon the planning method that you choose within the planning tab. So here you can see this one would be included in the MRP. Along with that, you also set other things that you want the MRP to take into account, whether you make or buy the item, how often you would like an order interval to be suggested, which you can define either weekly, daily, or monthly. So you can have multiple definitions. The order multiple is the amount that you want the MRP to suggest as your quantities to be ordered. So in this case, 20 would mean that you'll get multiples of 20. The minimum order tells you how much, or rather tells the MRP how much you want at least to have as a minimum amount. The lead time is the time that you expect this would take to either procure or to make, and your tolerance days are the days that you're going to subtract from the lead time. That is in case you feel that maybe, even though in this case you have 6 days as your lead time, you really only rely on a 4-day lead time.
In addition, there are some other definitions within the item master data that will affect MRP. Some of them are under the inventory data, minimum, maximum, and required inventory level, and we can see that in the MRP run. In this case, I manage inventory by warehouses, so for each one of the warehouses, I can define min, max, and required. Okay.
That's correct.
Also
on the, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Go ahead, Travis. This is under the purchasing data.
Right, I was going to mention under purchasing, for those items that you mark as buy, you have a preferred vendor setting. So this is what the MRP takes into consideration when suggesting purchase orders as the vendor that you should purchase these items from. Then also on the production data tab, you have the ability to mark an item as a phantom item, and this just allows you to define some greater variables that you want to take into account when it comes to recommendations on a production order standpoint.
Excellent, excellent. Any questions so far? I think we muted the line, so the audio will be working well, but if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat area of the GoToMeeting. The other thing before we get into running the MRP wizard are the forecast options. And there are a couple of ways where we could use a forecast. One thing is based on your understanding of clients and your future growth. You could import from Excel the forecast or copy paste from Excel. The other thing is that you could have the system generate the forecast for you based on the history of the item and the averages of the item. So let's look how that works. So going back to SAP, if I open the MRP menu, I see that we have three sub-menus. One is the forecast, one is the MRP wizard, and one is the order recommendation. We're gonna take a look at all of those. The forecast is basically allow you to define as many forecast scenarios as you wish. In this case, I will create a forecast code. Let's call it MRP webinar. And you could have a forecast that is either monthly, weekly, or daily. I recommend to use that depending on how you run the MRP and how your planning is. So if you plan weekly, I would do that weekly and stuff like that. And then you could choose the items that are going to be included in your forecast. So you can also copy paste or import that using the DTW. Or I can choose selected items, and then if I wish, I can go to Excel and copy paste the figures from Excel, or bring them from DTW, or the other option is to generate forecasts. So if I go to generate forecast, we can see that I can choose which warehouses I want to consider. In this case, only the main warehouse will be included. And then I can choose which items I want to create forecast to. And then the advanced settings will tell us how do we want to calculate the forecast. So if you want to base it on the history, we can do either simple average or weekly history. And then I can choose if I want to base my history on the sales orders created or really just on deliveries or AR invoices, which are what was delivered. And then I can choose how to calculate my simple average or my weekly average, like from which date, which period I want to take into consideration. In that case, maybe I'll take from the beginning of the month, and it's automatically rounding that to the beginning of the week. And if I click OK, it will bring those numbers. As you can see, I have my quantities with decimal. That's why it does that. And then let's say if we know our company is 20%, have a 20% growth, things of that nature, I can mark those lines and then say we have 25% growth, and clicking on the plus will increase all those numbers to reflect that growth. Any questions so far? Okay, we'll add that for now. That's just a discount. We can delete that. Let's generate a new forecast just for relevant items. Generate forecast from the beginning of the month. And we'll do 30% growth. Okay. Our next topic is getting granular and getting into the MRP, and this is the whole introduction was to get into that. It is relatively simple process, the MRP. You want to ensure a couple of things. You want to ensure that your item setup is accurate. So you may want to run a query or a couple of reports to ensure that your data in your item master data that we walked you through is accurate. The second thing that is really important for the MRP to be successful is due dates. So if you have open sales orders, open POs, and you have a delivery date on those POs and sales orders or sales quotation, things of that nature, make sure that the delivery date is constantly updated. So if you have a delay with a sales order to a customer, make sure you update that delivery date. If you have different delivery dates in the row for each item, make sure you update those delivery dates, expected delivery dates on POs and sales orders, because this is a key component for the MRP to work appropriately. Okay, so two things: item setup and DTW to update the item with the correct setup, and the second thing is delivery dates on different documents. So let's see how that works. So the MRP really have set amount of steps.
Yes, there's 6 steps within the MRP wizard that you go through. The first step is where you can define the scenario that you're going to run. So here you can either choose from an existing scenario, or you can create a new one. The benefit of having the ability to save multiple scenarios is that you may want to run different types of settings through similar sets of data to get a better recommendation overall, or if you're trying to be more robust in your reporting.
So we'll start creating here a new scenario, an MRP webinar, and the second step is really to plan the horizon. So we have a start date, end date. Because I'm planning in weeks, in this case, I will choose weeks. And then if I choose today's date, it will run that to the beginning of the week. So it's always going to be Monday. And the end date also going to always run it to Sunday, which is the end of the week. So for example, if I plan the next 3 months, let's say, or a couple of months, 11/30, we don't have 31st, it will run it to 12/2, which is the closest Sunday. Or I can also choose to have how many weeks. So if I do 11 weeks, that will change accordingly. And then we have consider holidays. Consider holidays. MRP, when it runs, can consider your weekends and holidays. So if you have a lead time and your vendor doesn't work on the weekend and there are no deliveries on the weekend and maybe there is a national holiday, things of that nature, you can consider holidays. And you consider, and that table of the holidays is fully configurable for you as a client. Let me just quickly show you where it's at. It's under the accounting data in the company details, under holidays, and this is what determines what holiday the system considered at this point. So if I drill down, for example, in this case, in 2012, you have all the dates of 2012. You can define what is the weekend for you, when it's valid, and things of that nature. You can add your own special days off. Depends on your vacation policy in the company. And if you wish, you can always copy that table and go creating a 2018 calendar and paste that here, and create a whole new calendar. And then you need to make sure you associate the right period with your company, so MRP really takes the holiday into consideration. A couple of other things just from a presentation point of view. How do you want the results to be? How do they want them to display? What's the sorting is going to look like? Maybe by item groups, maybe by assembly sequence. what the sorting is going to be like, and you can run simulation as well in addition to an actual run. In this case,
Also,
yeah, go ahead.
I was going to mention one other interesting feature is where it says to ignore cumulative lead time. So normally what happens is that the MRP looks at the lead times that are set on the items that you select, and if you have 5 days on one and 6 days, or multiple rather, I should say, suggestions for a single item, and you have a 5-day lead time, it adds all of that together. But you could choose to have it ignore that and only look at the lead time on a per suggestion basis. And there may be reasons for wanting to choose that when doing an MRP run.
That's a good point, very good point. Thank you, Travis.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, we will go to the next one. This is a screen where you can select which items are going to be participated in the MRP run. So you can obviously run it for all items that marked as MRP in the item master data. It's not going to do that for all items, just the items that are marked as MRP. Or you can run it only for selected items, and when you add items, you can select by a group of items, by item properties, or you could also select specific UDFs that you have in the item. Only for those it will run. For example, we have some companies or some customers that are separating the inventory into groups of A, B, C. A is being the most critical items that you really want to plan on a daily or weekly basis. B are being the items that are less important, and C are nuts and bolts that do not have a big cost and do not take space in the warehouse, and you don't need to manage them carefully. So in that case, we have a UDF called item class or item group, another grouping, and then you could select I want to run it only for those items. Okay. In this case, we will run it for all items. I have it's a sandbox environment, so I don't have too many items here. So I will just select all items, and I will click on next. Pay attention that you can always save the scenario. At any step, you can save your selection. So if you cancel out of that, you can go back to the same scenario with your settings saved.
On step 4, this is where we get to choose what warehouses we want to include within the MRP. So first, you can either choose whether you're going to run it by company or by warehouse. Company will essentially just roll everything up into one and then give you the supply, demand, or recommendations to the default warehouse. Where if you look at it as a per warehouse basis, it looks at each individual warehouse on its inventory, demand, and supply, and then gives recommendations for each individual warehouse. In this scenario, we're just going to choose the main warehouse. So you can double click the header of each column to remove that and then select what warehouses you want to include.
Yep. In addition, when you do choose the warehouse, the system can also recommend, and you choose multiple warehouse, the system can also recommend you to do inventory transfers. We'll hit next. This is it. This is really the main screen of the MRP wizard. This is where you define what do you want to take into consideration as the source, and all the main definitions for you. So once you configure that, I would definitely save, and then you can just run the same scenario over and over again. And there are some critical items to consider here. The first one is the time range. Within planning horizon, within the dates we specify in the MRP, I'm always recommending to use including historical data. Historical data means that if you forgot to update the delivery dates on sales order and it's past due basically, and it's not within the horizon, it will bring the data into the MRP as part of the demand, if that makes sense. So I definitely recommend to check that. There is other sources of demand and supply which we can choose from. So for example, you can choose if to consider purchase quotation in addition to purchase order, or not at all consider the purchase order. Blanket purchase agreement, so this is all on the purchasing side, is the source of the supply. You could consider all purchase order, but maybe you have one purchase order you put in place that is not, you don't want to consider because it's not yet finalized, things of that nature. And you could have MRP ignore them by telling the MRP which transaction you want to ignore. And you have multiple selection by document number, by delivery dates of those documents, and specific project and things of that nature. Very similarly, you have those restrictions for any other documents. So, if you have a big sales order that is not yet confirmed and you want to restrict that, you can do that as well. Other transactions that are going to determine the demand are sales order, blanket agreement, transfers, production order, reserved invoices as well, reoccurring transactions that you set up that could drive demand and supply and things of that nature.
All right, and at the inventory level, this is where you can define if you want to take into account the required amount that you set on the inventory master data, the minimum, maximum, or a range in between. When selecting something like the min or the max, the recommendations are going to come across as just to get you to that minimum or to get you to that maximum. If you choose the range between, it will, based on order multiples, give you a number that is between the min and the max. And then with the forecast, you can choose the forecast you want to take into consideration with this particular MRP run. It doesn't have to be selected, but it's available.
Yeah, and you can always drill down to make sure your numbers are accurate or to update them and things of that nature. And then in the recommendations, we could have multiple types of recommendation. I can say in the purchasing area, I can either get recommendations for purchase request or actually create purchase orders. I'm going to choose purchase orders because at any time I can go ahead and update those purchase orders after being created. The other thing, production orders, we have some make items, so automatically MRP recognized that we have make and buy, so it selected both of those recommendations. And I can select or not whether to use inventory transfers as well or not, okay?
I'd also make the recommendation when it comes to inventory level, if you don't have any sort of mins or max set, to just leave that one blank so that the MRP gives you a better run.
Okay. And before I'm going to run the MRP, I'm going to save the scenario. If anybody have any questions, we'll be happy to answer. So feel free to write it in the chat. Sorry. In that case, I'm gonna just run the MRP. This is where it goes through all the items and generate the requirements for us. I'm gonna do a view fit column width, and I'm gonna maximize that window. And we see two types of results. We see reds, which are possible problems, and we see black, which is no issues, and we will be able to meet the demand if we consider the MRP and obviously follow the recommendation. We can always go to the recommendations tab to see what purchase orders and what production orders are being suggested with the quantities and dates and things of that nature. And again, anytime we have the red, it's an area of concern. Let's go back to the report and see what visibility it gives us. First, we could check filter possible problems and really focus just on the red items to drill down and to see what's the problem. So if you look at that range, we see that the initial inventory is really zero, but we have a supply basically two purchase orders that are overdue. We see again that the due date in my sandbox environment is not updated, but because I consider historical data, it brings them into the picture. But again, it's important if you see those type of things to always, and it's open, it means it hasn't been received, always to update those delivery dates and update the rows, yes, and update and so forth. And then we see that the past due data is 110. We also see that there is a demand of sales orders that was supposed to be shipped yesterday. And then it runs us through the weeks, week by week. So we see that there is a recommendation of the MRP to order 2.84. It's a purchase order. We see no link because it's a recommendation, so it's not yet an actual document in the system. And then we see that we have another demand here that is coming today. Seems like the due date of that item is 0 because it gives us a recommendation on the same time, and let's just validate that within the planning data of the item, and we see that the lead time is 25. So that 248 is probably for that supply over here. It will expect to get over here and answer that demand to have inventory available for the week 44. But
and the reason that it's kind of coming in red is also because of the lead time being 25 days from the time that you ran the MRP. It feels that it can't get that into inventory within a reasonable amount of time based on the lead time.
Yeah, and in those cases, you know, I'm sure every client have different options, either to, you know, to do air shipments and other things that maybe cost more money, but will handle the demand and the promises to the client. Other items that we have no problems with, for example, are the bags. The bags is an item that we need to purchase, and we see that we have some inventory in place, right, over 1 million units. We have some supply, we have some demand currently in place that is actually past due, but it includes them because we decide to include them. And then we see what happens when we have, for example, a purchase order recommendation for week 40. It's because of that PITW, we have a bill of materials that will consume those bag items because we have a production plan for the parent item. And with that being said, we could, by the way, expand everything or collapse, save recommendations. If we wish, from here, we can go to the order recommendation window and see what needs to be executed, mark, review that, and execute. But sometimes in some companies, the person that is doing the MRP is not the person that is going to create the PO or the production order. In some companies, somebody create the MRP and some other person, the procurement manager, is generating the POs, for example, and the production manager is generating the production orders. So for that, we have another screen with another authorizations. And since we saved the recommendation, we can just finish and leave that window. It's already saved the recommendations. And then we can go to the third item under the MRP menu, which is the order recommendations.
Here you can choose which scenario you want to run. So we can choose that last scenario we looked at. And you can also choose what you want to look at from the scenario, whether it be the production orders, purchase orders, inventory transfers, or everything. You can also select ranges of your due dates and release dates to kind of better filter maybe the results that you want to look into.
So in this case, let's start with our production based on that scenario, because they could have run multiple scenarios. We're going to run for production orders. And we can see that the system recommended us to execute 4 production orders for one quantity, 407 and 85 million pistachios. It also shows us what's the release date recommended for those production order, what's the due date with some kind of alerting, because it's red, we know it's gonna create some issues for the demand. It brings the default warehouses, things of that nature. We could potentially change those before creating. So we can say, I know about my production floor and it's not gonna be available for 10.4, maybe it's gonna be available for 10.10. And we see also the exception, so the reason for that being great. If we're ready to execute those, we could define what do we want to execute. And also we can change potentially the type. You know, some companies do the production themselves, but also use a third party to manufacture for them when the demand is higher. So in this case, maybe because it's red, I want to create a purchase order for that item, so I don't have to do the production. I can also do purchasing document from here. But in that case, we're going to execute 4 production orders. One of them is invalid. Let me run that again. Maybe for those 2 items, and 2 production orders got created. So if we go to the production area, I see now 2 production orders. We see that the origin is from the MRP. We see the start and the due date based on the MRP recommendation. And it's still on planned mode, so I can change anything on that production order, whether it's the due date, whether it's the quantity I want to manufacture, maybe get more details about the availability of the items and things of that nature. Also, the other production order is here that is also originated from the MRP with the due dates with some. You can see that we have a couple of new things in here, like resources and routing stages. It doesn't have to get that granular. It could be just pure item to consume them. But from 9.2 and 9.3, you now have an option to manage resources and to manage routing as well. So that was the production. The other thing was the purchase orders. So same amount, same kind of selection criteria. And I see all the production orders on a weekly basis that I need to schedule. So each one is going to be for a different week. You see the due dates and the possible problems you have. You will see the default vendor coming automatically from the default vendor defined for the item. You can here change it. It brings automatically the pricing and the special discount from the vendor. Let me again see if I can fit. No, I cannot fit it here. So I'm just gonna do that. For example, so I can always select a different vendor, and if I do select a different vendor, system will ask me if to update price based on the new vendor, and I'm going to say yes. So as you can see, the price is changing because of that vendor have a different price, and things of that nature. We do have some items that do not have default vendors, and for those, I do need to choose a vendor before I am able to execute the MRP run. Can select it from the table, and I will get the same question, and I will select the vendor. Maybe I don't have a price list for that vendor, so I need to choose the price manually. Also here I have control tab, so I can see what are the list prices. Control tab is either with control tab on the field. The right click from some reason is not available here. And then you can see what were the historical prices between a specific date for that vendor. Maybe I want to see all vendors' prices, so that gives me that visibility. Okay. The warehouse we're going to receive it at, and additional details. Maybe it's related to a blanket agreement, stuff like that. So at this point, you can execute all your purchase order for the next 3 months. You will still want to run the MRP on a weekly basis to see if anything changed, if delivery date changed, if new sales order got into place. So you still want to potentially run the MRP on a weekly or a daily basis to see if anything new happened. But once I execute those purchase orders, they're in place, and in the next MRP run, it will take them into consideration as supply that is supposed to come. So I can select everything. In that case, I will probably gonna get a couple of error messages because I do not have a default vendor here. So because of that, I'm gonna select only some of the rows. I'm going to click update, and the system just created 2 new purchase orders, not for the whole next few months, just for that week. I can always go back to the purchase order. I can see the origin is from MRP. I can see the posting date today, and the delivery date is per the MRP requirements. And obviously, my data is, you know, is giving me partial quantity because it's a test database. But if you put the appropriate setup on the item, it should give you full. In this case, I have one item that maybe needs to be ordered multiple times. So it created one purchase order with multiple delivery dates, and each one will get executed in a different date. I can change everything I wanted. Maybe I have a different price list. Now, maybe the quantity I want to create is 30 because I want to order for stock as well. Maybe it's the first time I ran the MRP, so now I'm starting to manage better quantities and things of that nature. And I update, and from here I can follow the regular procurement processes, like you know, print that or send that to the vendor via email or export to PDF, going through approval procedures and things of that nature.
Going back to the point of where you mentioned the delivery dates as well, you pointed out something really good there on the row level, that you can have different delivery dates on a row level. That also gets included in the MRP. So when you have a document where you're defining different delivery dates at the row level, the MRP isn't just looking at the top of the document, it's actually looking at the row per item. And so those will then be reflected in the next MRP run.
So this is the majority of the MRP. So let's just kind of quickly review what we did today. We went through definitions of MRP that are in general settings, inventory planning. This will determine how to consume forecast. We did talk about item group definition, which will be the default for when creating new items. We discussed the item master data and what definitions needs to happen in the item master data. We talked about the planning data that is very important. We talked about the default vendor, and we talked about the min, max, and required. So this is very critical. I really recommend, if it's the first time you're using MRP, you know, to run a query with all those fields and to make sure that all of those updated and accurate. And then we run the MRP, and we talked about three things: about the ability to create forecasts, the MRP wizard with the different steps, and the order recommendation for purchasing, for production, as well as for inventory transfers. All right, happy Friday, everyone. We look forward for the next session. If you do have specific topics, please feel free to send it over to Jennifer or myself, and we'll include that in the next webinar. Thank you very much for everybody who's listening. We appreciate